Hello, my name is Dmitry Zinoyev. I am professor of mathematics and computer science at Suffolk University, Boston, Massachusetts. This work has been done together with Gary Fireman, professor of psychology from the same university. We are going to talk about social media response of college students to the transition into online teaching. The objective of the study is to observe how college students in the United States responded to transition into online teaching caused by coronavirus pandemic in 2020. Our data set consists of 720,000 tweets, mostly in English, that were collected between February 4th, 2020, which was the latest start of the spring semester, and May 24th, 2020, which is one day before killing of George Floyd. Our data set includes 6,200 currently enrolled students, mostly undergraduate. We identified the students by snowballing, that is, identifying some students who clearly belong to one of the schools of interest, and then looking at their friends and the friends of friends and checking whether they're enrolled in the same school. So we looked at 24 institutions, both public and private, and located everywhere on the political spectrum, ranging from conservative to liberal. This comprises 7% of the overall enrolled student body of those universities. On average, we have 116 tweets per student in our collection. Only 65% of identified accounts were active within the time frame, so 32% of accounts were dormant and not further included in our study. This map shows that the colleges in our collection, 24 of them, are both on the East Coast and in the West Coast, including Hawaii. Some of them are in the South, some of them are in the Northeast. Originally, we wanted to look only at Suffolk University students and collected several thousand students who belong to SU universities, and only later realized that there were a lot of other SU universities in this country. That's how we ended up with Simmons, Shepherd, Shenandoah, Salisbury, Susquehanna, and others. So we expect to see three types of responses. First, we are looking at structural response, the changes of quantitative tweeting measures, such as tweeting frequency and the like. Second, we want to look at sentimental response, whether students expressed more or fewer negative and positive sentiments. And finally, we wanted to identify semantic response, change of topics of discourse. Let's first look at the structural response. I would like to introduce three temporal phases of the transition. They were calculated by k-means clustering analysis. I will show you detail later in this presentation. The first phase starts at the beginning of data collection on the 4th of February and ends just before March 10th, the official announcement of the pandemic in the USA. So we call it phase 1. The second phase ends on April 3rd. We call it the transitional phase, the pink phase in the diagram. And the third phase is post-transitional from April 3rd to the end of the data collection period, data collection window on the 24th of May. So as you can see, there was a significant increase in daily tweeting frequency in phase 2, which was followed by gradual decline. Tweeting frequency never returned to phase 1 level. Our original goal was to wait until it returns to the phase 1 level. Unfortunately, on the 25th of May, there was killing of George Floyd, which sparkled so much Twitter activity that the activity associated with coronavirus was completely submerged. So this is the second stage of structural response. We're looking at the frequencies of hashtags, mentions, and retweets. As you can see, in phase 2, we have more retweets, but in phase 3, the frequency of retweets goes below the original frequency of retweets. So we interpret it as students got their own voice and they are willing to tell the story of transition in their own language rather than retweet from other accounts. We have fewer mentions in phase 2, but we have more mentions in phase 3. We interpret it as we've got more targeted tweets. And finally, we've got a sharp decline of the frequencies of hashtags in phases 2 and 3. So we think of it as tweets being less formal and using more words which were not supposed to be hashtags. The sentimental response was calculated by using three corpora, two manually curated corpora of joyful and depressive words, and a large corpus of negative words downloaded to the internet. So what we can see, quite expectedly, that during phase 2 we've got many fewer joyful words, but the number of negative words insignificantly increased. The number of joyful words, however, increased significantly in the third phase, so we interpret it as students were expressing joy of returning to some sort of normalcy. The frequency of depressive words was sticky, it did not change back to the pre-pandemic levels. The number of negative words increased insignificantly in phase 2 and stayed elevated during stage 3. The semantic response was calculated as a frequency of words that belong to one of 7 manually identified topics, such as coronavirus as such words, COVID, coronavirus, pandemic, epidemic, and the like, coronavirus or COVID other, which is related to isolation, social distancing, emotional words, entertainment-related words, including sports and movies, family-related words, politics-related words, and school-related words. The words and the topics were identified manually. We will look at more accurate topic modeling through LDA and by terms. So as you can see, in the second phase, we've got a sharp spike in topics related to school, coronavirus, and entertainment. Entertainment is actually a negative spike. It is the lack of entertainment, such as cancelled sports and movies, rather than entertainment as such. We also see a broad spike of coronavirus other topic, which is related to social distancing, quarantining, mask wearing, $1,200 reimbursement checks, and the like. In phase P3, in the third phase, we see that most of the topics, except for coronavirus other, the blue one, return to their phase 1 levels, more or less. There is also an interesting spike in family-related and emotional words associated with Mother's Day. Here's the slide that actually talks about phase definition. That should have been shown in place of slide number 6, but I wanted to introduce all the measures before I talk about the phase definition. So we treated each day in our collection, about 110 days, as a point in a 14-dimensional space where the coordinates are the 14 measures introduced before, such as the frequency of tweets, the frequency of retweets, the frequency of mentions, and everything else. We used k-means clustering to group these days into 4 clusters, P1, P2A, P2B, and P3, based on their Cartesian distances. Then we combine phase P2A and P2B into one phase P2. There were actually 2 sub-stages in transitioning, but we did not want to overload our presentation with too much data. The definition of the 7 semantic topics already depends on the definition of phases, as you could see in the previous slide. So we have a sort of a chicken and egg problem. But if we can go through this process a number of times, we can converge on more or less stable solutions. Also, formal topic modeling may help in the future. We also looked at the variance of our measures. For each college, we've got the size of the college in terms of the enrollment, or rather the log of that size, which seems to be a more explanatory variable. We also have a percentage of self-identified liberal versus conservative students and percentage of female students. We applied ordinary least square regression to all our independent variables, and the results are in the table on the right. Surprisingly, there is very little correlation between the dependent variables and college demographics. So the only clear thing that we can observe is that students in small schools tweet more than students in larger schools. So to conclude, transition to online teaching due to the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic caused major changes of students' tweeting habits. First, we see a bunch of structural changes. We see more tweets and more mentions, fewer retweets and hashtags. The tweets became more targeted and less formal. Sentimental changes reveal that tweets became more joyful and more depressive at the same time in phase 3, which may suggest that the student population became more bipolar. Finally, we've got semantic changes. There is more talk about pandemic-related topics, but in the long run, not about online teaching. The way we interpret it is that students came to terms with being Zoomed and adopted online teaching.